And welcome to the Daily Space Weather. I'm your host, Dan, a.k.a. Smash-O-Mash, coming at you from the Smash News Network, least busted name in news. And we're starting things out today, checking out the closest star. So thanks for tuning in, stargazers. We've got another coronal mass ejection headed toward Earth. We can expect one in 2 days and one in 3 days. The latest one also came from this active region here. Sunspot 2958 is what it used to be called. Now it's just a plage, an active region. We've got a new sunspot rising here as well, Sunspot 2964, and a new sunspot in the southern hemisphere as well. So here is the south. Sunspot 2963 has just formed in here in between 2957 and 2960. Also some plasma reorganization happening down here. It's just spectacular. Exciting stuff going on from the closest star. Another prime example of how we don't need solar flares or sunspots even to produce coronal mass ejections. Next, looking at the last 4 hours of magnetohydrodynamic pressure in the earthly space. So we're moving on to magnetic features here for a brief moment before we go back to the sun. Magnetic features, kind of important. And we see a low pressure in between the Earth and Sun at the moment, as we've seen a subsiding of the high-speed coronal hole wind stream. Next, looking at ground magnetic perturbations, Earth's magnetic moment from the ground. The last was Earth's magnetic moment from space. Here's Earth's magnetic moment from the ground level. And things quite calm here. Just some stable, relatively stable magnetic fields here showing up on our ground magnetic perturbations map. Geospace Delta B changes to Earth's B field. We'll let that play through so we don't have to edit the video and get it on your screen as quickly as possible. If you've noticed changes to the format, well, we have too. It's all on purpose, thanks to our new viewers and subscribers, etc. That's the last 4 hours of Earth's magnetic moment from the ground. Let's take a look at the GOES magnetometers next. Here you go. The last 3 days looking a little spiky here. Again, there are 2 coronal mass ejections now headed toward Earth. The first one expected to be a minor glancing blow, and the second one. We'll show you more in-depth information on that momentarily. Next, the heliospheric current sheet. Earth remains in a south pole current sheet shown here in red. So the plasma coming from the sun is oriented to one pole or the other. Earth is in a south pole current sheet. Here's a line of sight view. Again, we have a new sunspot rising here. It'll be known as Sunspot 2964. It's already beta gamma class sunspot, it looks like, certainly. Next, let's look at the line of sight coronal hole plot. Now, one thing about coronal holes, folks, is they are more visible using polarization. So viewing it from the magnetic field perspective gives us additional insight, and it's easier to see them from this National Sunspot Observatory magnetic data than it is from the 193 angstroms view, as the solar corona is very bumpy, and it has a tendency to hide features that are behind giant walls of plasma. Anyway, that's the sun's B field in blue there, and you can see some trans-equatorial coronal holes there. All of the South Pole variety. So the South Solar Polar Field there in the process of making its migration to the north and vice versa as the fields reverse and cycle 25 continues to progress. So here's 193 angstroms, and you can see one of these South Pole-oriented coronal holes showing up here. Also the location of the coronal mass ejection making itself clear. It's former sunspot 2958. I reiterate, we don't need sunspots or solar flares to see coronal mass ejections. That one is headed toward Earth. Before we move on to the sunspots, I would like to remind our YouTube viewers to consider becoming a member of the Smash team at smashomash.com/Smash team. If you enjoy the content and prefer to see it continue to exist and remain publicly visible, smashomash.com/Smash team. You'll get additional information there, similar but superior to Patreon. There was a point where we reached 11 named groups here, according to the Flare Monitor. But at the moment, we certainly have 2961, 2957, 2963, 2960, 2962, and now rising 2964. Likelihood of large flares remains quite high indeed. Let's take a look at some more in-depth information about sunspots with the SDO imagery in 1700 angstroms. So a new sunspot is formed right in here. That's 2963. 2964 just rising up here. And I've lost track. That is too many sunspots to memorize. I don't want to call them the wrong thing. And here at the end of this video, you'll see the rising of 2964 right there. You can see some dark ombre rising behind sunspot 2962, which has degraded a little bit. But the sunspot number is still going to go up because we're going to see lots of ombre from sunspot 2964. Here's the entirety of the northern hemisphere, and here's the southern hemisphere. Great imagery there of by far the largest sunspot group, sunspot 2960. Mostly stable here over the past 24. Maybe shrunk a little bit. Let's look at flares. One thing to note here is that the background level of flaring has moved almost into a C-class background level of X-ray output. In other words, when you just see this line up here on the sea level, that's not really a flare, that's just the X-ray output. So this is what you'd expect to see with lots of sunspots on the Earth-facing portion of the solar disk. Let's see if we have any relativistic particles showing up. So no major flares, just a couple C-class intensifications, which are barely even intensifications. No relativistic particles. We've got 2 coronal mass ejections headed our way. We'll talk about that momentarily. First, the real-time solar wind. So here is the real-time solar wind. Quite a diffuse solar wind at the moment at only 3.6 protons per cubic centimeter. And a slowing down since yesterday, now down to 430 kilometers per second. The rest of those panes are fairly unremarkable. KP index, a measurement of global geomagnetism, now at 1. Geomagnetic calm conditions over the past 2.5 days, following a decent coronal hole-induced geomagnetic storm. Next, we'll show you a diagram for astrography purposes of where things are located. That's astrography, folks, where things are located. Here's a 1-week forecast for the solar system as Mercury speeds around. Here's where things will be in a week. We'll have a gibbous waxing. Next, a star chart from in-the-sky.org. The yellow line is the ecliptic. That's the path the sun takes across the sky. The blue line is the galactic plane. You may see Venus and Mars and Saturn and Mercury and Jupiter rising ahead of the sun depending on your horizon. I like to face mine to the south as I'm currently facing the south, and so is my couch, and so is the ecliptic. So, with good reason, we've got it facing that direction. And let's look at the latest coronal mass ejection, yet another one happening earlier today. It is Earth-directed. We've got a coronagraph at stereo A and a coronagraph at Lagrange 1. Before we get to that, I would remind our viewers that our other 2 daily space weather videos are on Twitch. We'll have streamed them live by the time this premieres. And so here's the view. I've frozen these at about 7:23 on the stereo A coronagraph. So on your left here, stereo A located at Lagrange point 5. See that coronal mass ejection? Now, from this perspective, Earth would be off to your right. From this perspective, Earth would be behind you. And so we've got a second coronal mass ejection headed toward the Earth. This is another glancing diffuse blow. It's not expected to be any major CME impact, but you can see some ejecta on both sides of the coronagraph there, an indication that it is indeed an Earth-facing CME. There was one on the far side of the sun as well, which may make it a little more deceptive. But when you break it down based on the timing, that is more plasma headed toward Earth. So we can expect that one to show up in about 3 days, the other one in about 2 days. So the one that we covered yesterday, in about 2 days, this one in about 3 days. We can expect it to arrive here at Earth. And that's your in-depth daily space weather video for the day. Thanks for tuning in. Congratulations on realizing the channel exists. And may that solar wind be at your back.